He was a Navy SEAL who spent his last money on a house everyone else had already given up on. They said it was nothing but ashes. A mistake no one could fix. But his dog refused to leave the center of that burned ground like something there was still alive. The first night, a storm came. Strangers found their way to his unfinished shelter. And by morning, the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was something the whole town began to feel. Then a man arrived with papers, ready to take it all away. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep sharing meaningful stories. Now, let's begin. The road into Ashbrook bent like a quiet thought that had taken too long to finish. Gideon Hale drove it slowly, both hands steady on the wheel, though there was no traffic, no urgency. Nothing pressing him forward except the quiet insistence of a decision already made. Snow still clung in patches along the roadside, thin, stubborn, like old men who refused to leave the porch even after winter had officially ended. The sky above was pale, not quite blue, not quite gray, stretched thin across the northern horizon like a worn blanket. Beside him, Bruno watched the world pass. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, sable-coated black layered over brown like smoke over embers. His amber eyes didn't wander the way most dogs' eyes did. They settled. They studied. There was a calm intelligence in him, not restless, not eager to please, just mighty present. The kind of presence that made silence feel less empty. Bruno didn't pant, didn't bark. He simply observed. Gideon envied that. He hadn't always been a quiet man. Once, his voice had carried commands through chaos, cut through gunfire, pulled men forward when fear tried to anchor them in place. But war had a way of sanding a person down. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily. Until there wasn't much left to say. Ashbrook appeared without announcement. A few houses. A diner with a flickering sign. A church whose paint had begun to peel in thin, curling strips. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, thin white lines dissolving into the cold air. It was the kind of town that didn't pretend to be anything more than it was, and didn't apologize for it either. Gideon liked that. Or maybe he just didn't have the energy to like anything complicated anymore. He drove past the center without stopping. A couple of men standing outside the diner glanced at his truck. Once one nudged the other, said something. They didn't wave. That was fine. He wasn't here to belong. Not yet. The hill came into view after a turn that wasn't marked on any proper sign. Just a worn path cutting through a line of thin birch trees. The tires crunched softly over gravel and thawing ice as Gideon guided the truck upward. And there it was. What remained of a house. It wasn't much. Not in the way people usually measured things. No roof, no intact walls. Just a skeleton of blackened beams, collapsed inward like a body that had finally given up holding itself together. The foundation was still there, a rectangle of scorched wood and stone. At one end stood a chimney brick, soot-stained, stubborn. It didn't lean. It didn't crumble. It stood. Gideon killed the engine. Silence settled immediately, thick and complete, broken only by the faint whisper of wind moving through the trees. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply sat there, in hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed on the remains. This was what he had bought, a tax default property, county-owned, auctioned quietly, almost as an afterthought. The file had been thin, too thin, just a name attached to it. Miriam Ashcroft. No heirs, no claimants. Just a note in the margin that most buyers had ignored. Property historically used for community aid. Condition, fire damage. Structural rebuild required. Most people had seen risk. Gideon had seen space. He opened the door. Cold air slid in like a hand slipping into a sleeve familiar, uninvited, unavoidable. Bruno jumped down first, landing softly, his paws making almost no sound against the damp earth. Gideon followed, boots heavier, deliberate. They stood there together for a moment. Man, dog, ruin. Bruno moved first. He didn't rush, didn't circle wildly like a curious animal. He walked forward in a straight line, nose low, following something invisible. He stepped over charred wood, was paused near a broken beam, then continued toward the center of the foundation. Gideon watched him. There were moments, with Bruno, when it felt less like he owned a dog, and more like he had been assigned a witness. Bruno reached the middle of what had once been the main room. Then he stopped. Sat. Not casually. Not in the loose, relaxed way dogs rested when they were tired. This was different. His back was straight, ears forward, gaze fixed, not on Gideon, not on the trees, but somewhere slightly ahead, slightly downward, as if there were something there that refused to be seen. Gideon felt it then. Not fear. Not quite curiosity either. Just a shift, a small, almost imperceptible change in the air, like the moment before a storm, when the world holds its breath without realizing it. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching over ash and old nails. "What is it?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. Bruno didn't look at him. Didn't move, just stayed, and for reasons Gideon couldn't explain, not logically, not cleanly, he found himself stopping a few feet short of the exact spot where the dog sat. He didn't step onto it. Not yet. A faint sound reached him then. Not from the trees. Not from the wind. From beneath. It was subtle, easy to miss. A soft, hollow, creak-like wood shifting under pressure, or something adjusting where it had been still for too long. Bruno's ears twitched once. Gideon froze. The foundation was supposed to be dead. Burned out. Empty. And yet, something under his feet had just answered the weight of his presence. The moment passed. Just like that. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the broken structure, carrying with it the dry scent of old smoke and damp earth. Gideon exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders in a controlled release. And he stepped forward then, deliberately placing his boot where Bruno had been watching. The wood didn't give, didn't creak again, just solid. Cold. Lifeless. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "Probably nothing." He didn't quite believe it, but belief had never been something he trusted much anyway. He moved through the rest of the foundation, mapping it in his head the way he had once mapped buildings in places far less forgiving. Entry points, weak spots, load-bearing remnants. The chimney stood at the far end, its bricks darkened but intact. He ran a hand over it. The surface was rough, warm only where sunlight touched it. Still standing. That mattered. Behind him, Bruno had finally shifted. The dog rose, stretched once, then followed Gideon at an easy pace, as if the moment in the center had been noted, and filed away. They walked the perimeter together. Gideon crouched once, picking up a piece of charred wood. It was lighter than it should have been, brittle at the edges, and he turned it in his hand, thumb brushing over the blackened grain. Most people would see damage. He saw material. Not all of it was lost. Not all of it needed to be thrown away. He stood, tossing the piece aside gently rather than discarding it. "I'm not tearing it all down," he said aloud, more to himself than to Bruno. "Not everything." Bruno glanced up at him briefly, then looked back toward the center, as if he already knew. Gideon walked back to the truck, opened the bed, and pulled out a small metal toolbox. The weight of it was familiar. Grounding. Tools made sense. Wood made sense. Effort. Time. Structure. Those were things that obeyed rules. People didn't. War didn't. But this? This he could understand. He set the toolbox down near the edge of the foundation and looked out over the hill. From here, the lake was visible in the distance, its surface pale and still, reflecting the washed-out sky. Trees lined its edges, tall and quiet, their branches barely moving. It was a good place. Quiet enough. Far enough. For a moment, just a moment, Gideon allowed himself to imagine it finished. A roof. Walls. Light from a window spilling onto the ground at dusk. A fire burning inside. Not destructive this time, but controlled, contained, useful. Warmth. The image didn't feel unrealistic. It felt earned. Behind him, Bruno returned to the center once more, circling once before settling down again in the exact same spot. Gideon didn't stop him this time. He just watched. The dog lay there like a marker placed by something older than either of them, not claiming the space, but recognizing it. That was enough. Gideon picked up a crowbar, drove its edge under a loose board, and began. Each movement was deliberate, measured. No wasted force. The kind of work that didn't demand speed-only persistence. The first board came loose with a dry crack. Ash lifted into the air, catching sunlight in thin, drifting lines. Something old was being disturbed. Something that had waited. Gideon didn't rush, didn't speak. He just kept working. And as the sound of wood being pulled apart echoed softly across the hill, Ashbrook quiet, watchful Ashbrook began, without knowing it, to pay attention. Morning came without ceremony. No sunrise worth remembering. No dramatic light spilling across the hill. Just a slow, pale brightness that crept into the sky as if even the sun wasn't in a hurry to arrive. The air carried that particular northern chill, the kind that didn't bite but settled into your bones and waited. Gideon was already awake. He hadn't slept much. Not because of discomfort, the back seat of the truck had been worse before, but because silence, real silence, had a way of waking things inside him that noise used to keep buried. The kind of thoughts that didn't ask permission. He pushed the door open, boots hitting damp ground. Bruno was already outside. The dog stood near the edge of the foundation, facing the trees. His posture was still, alert, not tense, but attentive. His ears were angled forward, it's catching something distant, something faint. Gideon followed his gaze. Nothing. Just trees. Thin birch trunks, pale against darker forest behind them. Wind moved lightly through branches, making a soft whispering sound that could almost pass for speech if a man had been alone long enough. "Nothing there," Gideon said quietly. Bruno didn't react. That, Gideon had learned, didn't mean Bruno disagreed. It just meant the dog didn't feel the need to argue. Gideon rolled his shoulders once, then turned back toward the foundation. Work. That was something he could control. The first hour passed in steady motion. He moved boards, sorted debris, stacked anything salvageable to one side. The rhythm came back to him easily, the physical repetition, the measured use of force, the constant assessment of structure and weakness. It wasn't so different from clearing a room, from moving through wreckage overseas. Only this time, nothing was trying to kill him. That difference mattered. Bruno stayed close, not interfering, not wandering far. Every so often he would pick something up. A glove Gideon had dropped, a loose strap, and bring it over with quiet purpose. No excitement, just assistance, a working partner. Gideon crouched near the edge of the foundation, prying loose a warped beam. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a dull crack. Ash lifted, drifting in the air like faint gray snow. He paused, looked at the piece in his hands. Charred, yes, but not destroyed. The core was still solid. He set it aside carefully instead of tossing it. Not everything needed to be replaced. Some things just needed time and pressure in the right places. By mid-morning, the sound of an engine climbed the hill. Gideon didn't look up immediately. He finished setting a beam down, wiped his hands on his pants, then straightened. A pickup truck, older than his, paint faded, a body carrying more years than it bothered to hide, rolled to a stop a few yards away. The man who stepped out looked like he belonged to the truck the way bark belongs to a tree. Elias Boone. 68, maybe older, though not in a way that made him fragile. He was tall, in a weathered way lean, but not weak, shoulders still holding memory of strength. His face was carved by time, deep lines around the mouth, eyes narrowed not by suspicion, but by habit. A gray beard, uneven and practical, covered his jaw. His hands, large, rough, scarred, were the kind that had built things long before anyone thought to call it a profession. He didn't smile, didn't frown either. He just looked. At Gideon. At the foundation. At the wood stacked neatly to one side. Then he walked closer. "You're keeping it," Elias said, voice low, gravel thick. Not a question. Gideon nodded once. Some of it. Elias glanced at the salvaged beams again, but his eyes lingered there a moment longer than necessary. "Most folks would have burned it twice just to be sure." Gideon shrugged. "Seems like a waste." A corner of Elias's mouth moved. Not quite approval. Not quite dismissal. "Name's Boone," he said after a beat. "Built half the houses down in the valley. Other half I fixed when they tried to fall apart." "Gideon." Elias nodded as if the name confirmed something he hadn't said out loud. His gaze drifted across the structure again, slower this time. Measuring. Remembering. "She used to keep a fire going all winter," he muttered, almost to himself. "Didn't matter who came knocking." Gideon didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Some names lived in the way people looked at a place, not in how they spoke it. Elias crouched near the foundation, pressing a hand against one of the beams Gideon had already cleared. "Core's still good," he said. "You don't rip that out, you reinforce it." Gideon studied him for a moment. "You here to tell me I'm doing it wrong?" Elias snorted softly. "If you were, I wouldn't bother telling you. I'd just wait." A pause. Then, "I got tools." It wasn't an offer. Not exactly. More like a door left slightly open. Gideon nodded again. "Could use another set of hands." Elias stood, brushing dirt from his palms. "Yeah," he said. "You could." They worked without much conversation. Elias didn't give instructions the way people usually did. He corrected by doing. Adjusting a cut, repositioning a beam, tapping twice on wood instead of explaining why it wasn't aligned. Gideon understood that language. It wasn't so different from the teams he used to run with. You didn't talk more than necessary. You moved. You adapted. You trusted the person beside you to see what you saw, or at least to notice when you didn't. Bruno adjusted too. He shifted his position closer to Elias at times, watching the older man with the same quiet attention he gave everything else. Once, Elias reached down absent-mindedly, with fingers brushing the dog's head. Bruno didn't move away. That was something. By early afternoon, another vehicle arrived. Smaller, cleaner. The kind of car that didn't belong to someone who spent most of their time outdoors. A woman stepped out, closing the door with a controlled, careful motion. Naomi Mercer. Early 30s. Tall, but not imposing, more like someone used to standing her ground without needing to prove it. Her hair was a warm brown, tied loosely at the back, strands slipping free in the breeze. Her skin carried the faint paleness of someone who spent long hours indoors under artificial light, but her eyes, clear, steady, were anything but distant. She took in the scene quickly. The foundation. The two men. The dog. Bruno noticed her before Gideon did. He walked over, not running, not cautious, just direct. He stopped a few feet away, sitting, head slightly tilted as if asking a question only he understood. Naomi smiled faintly. "Hey there," she said, whilst her voice soft but grounded. She crouched, extending a hand, not reaching, just offering. Bruno stepped forward, sniffed once, then leaned slightly into her touch. Gideon watched that. Bruno didn't trust easily. Naomi stood again, brushing her hands together lightly. "He tore a pad," she said, nodding toward Bruno's back leg. Gideon frowned slightly. "When?" "Earlier," she replied. "Probably when he stepped over those nails." She walked past him without hesitation, heading toward the toolbox. "Got antiseptic?" she asked. Gideon pointed. "Top compartment." She opened it, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from repetition, not urgency. Her hands were steady, precise, not nervous, not unsure, used to helping. "You're new," she said without looking up. "Yeah," she glanced at him briefly. "Most people don't buy this place." Most people didn't. Another faint smile. Fair enough. As Naomi cleaned Bruno's paw, the dog suddenly stiffened. Not from pain. His head turned sharply, not toward the road. Not toward Elias, but back toward the center of the foundation, the exact same spot. His ears rose, a low sound, barely a growl vibrated in his chest. Naomi paused mid-motion. "What is it?" Gideon followed Bruno's gaze. Nothing had changed. The same broken boards, the same open sky. And yet, for a brief second, something in Gideon's chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar, like recognition without memory. Bruno took one step forward, then stopped. The moment dissolved. Just like that. Naomi exhaled quietly, finishing the bandage. "He'll be fine," she said, standing. "Just don't let him put full weight on it for a day or two." Gideon nodded. "Thanks." She hesitated, looking around once more. "You're not just rebuilding this," she said. It wasn't a question. Gideon met her gaze. "No," he said after a moment. "I'm not." She studied him for a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if something had been confirmed. "There's not a lot of places like this left," she said. "Well, not ones that stay open when things get bad." A beat. "If you're planning on keeping that door open," she added, "you're going to need more than wood." Gideon glanced at the structure, then at Elias, then at Bruno. "I know." Naomi gave Bruno one last scratch behind the ear, then turned back toward her car. "Then don't do it alone," she said over her shoulder. And just like that, she was gone. The work continued. Slower now, heavier, but different. Elias stayed. Bruno stayed near the center more often than before. And Gideon no longer felt like he was working on something empty. Each beam he lifted, each nail he pulled, each piece he chose to keep instead of discard. It all began to take shape, not just as a structure, but as something that remembered, something that waited. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather. The light shifted, softening, flattening the edges of everything. Wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a deeper cold. Gideon stood at the edge of the foundation, there looking out over the hill. The lake in the distance had turned a dull silver. Behind him, Bruno lay in the center. Still, present. Elias leaned against one of the remaining beams, arms crossed. "You planning on sleeping in that truck again?" he asked. "Probably." Elias grunted. "Storm's coming." Gideon nodded. He could feel it too. Not in the sky, in the air, in the way everything seemed to tighten just a little. He looked back at the foundation, then at the half-formed structure taking shape from it. "No," he said after a moment. Elias raised an eyebrow. Gideon picked up a tarp, moving toward the frame they had started. "Not tonight." The storm did not arrive with violence. It came the way winter often did in the north, quiet at first, almost polite, as if asking permission before taking over everything it touched. By dusk, the wind had changed. Not louder, just heavier. Gideon felt it in the way the air pressed against his chest when he stepped outside. The sky had flattened into a pale, endless gray, swallowing depth and distance alike. The lake beyond the hill was no longer visible, only a faint suggestion of something where something used to be. Inside the half-built structure, the tarp Gideon had secured stretched tight across the beams, snapping occasionally like a restrained animal testing its leash. It would hold. He had made sure of that. He always did. Bruno lay near the center of the foundation, front paws crossed, eyes half closed but not asleep. He never truly slept when the world felt wrong. His ears flicked now and then, tracking sounds beyond human range, the shifting of branches, the whisper of snow beginning to fall in thin, almost invisible grains. Gideon adjusted the last knot on the tarp, pulling it tighter against the frame Elias had helped him build earlier. "You've done worse with less," he muttered under his breath. Not a boast. A reminder. Behind him, the dog stood. Bruno moved toward the entrance, if it could even be called that yet, and stopped just inside the threshold. His posture was different now, not alert in the sharp, reactive way. Not tense. Anchored. Gideon noticed that. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he stepped back, scanning the structure once more. The beams held. The joints were crude, but stable. The ground beneath was still uneven, still carrying the scars of fire, but it was solid. Solid was enough. For now. The first knock came just after full dark. It wasn't a knock, not exactly. More like hesitation shaped into sound. A dull thud against the side of the truck, followed by silence. Gideon's head lifted immediately. His body shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but internally, every line of him aligned toward attention. Bruno didn't bark. He turned. That was enough. Gideon stepped outside. The wind cut sharper now, carrying fine snow that stung the face more than it soaked. Visibility had dropped. The world beyond a few yards was blurred into shifting white. A figure stood near the truck, small, uncertain, a woman. She held the door frame of the truck with one hand, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Gideon approached slowly, boots crunching over thin ice. "You all right?" he asked. The woman turned toward him. Lena Voss, late 20s, maybe younger, but exhaustion had a way of adding years where time hadn't. She was slight thin in the way that suggested not neglect, but strain. Her dark hair clung damply to her face, strands frozen at the edges. Her skin was pale, flushed unevenly by cold and effort, But it was her eyes that stood out wide, alert, carrying that particular sharpness of someone who had learned not to trust the world to stay still. There was a child in her arms, wrapped in layers that weren't enough. The boy, 3, maybe 4, was quiet. Too quiet. His small face was pressed against her shoulder, breath shallow but steady, eyes closed. Gideon didn't ask questions. He stepped aside. "Inside," he said. Lena hesitated, only for a second. Then she moved. Inside, the air was only slightly warmer, but out of the wind, it felt like a different world. Gideon grabbed a thick blanket from the truck, handing it over without ceremony. Lena took it with trembling hands, wrapping it tighter around the boy. "His name is Micah," she said, voice low, like she was afraid speaking too loudly might break something. Gideon nodded once. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a makeshift bench, 2 stacked boards, stable enough. She lowered herself carefully, holding the boy close, rocking slightly without realizing it. Bruno approached slowly. He did not go straight to the child. He stopped a few feet away, watching. Then, after a moment, he stepped closer and lay down beside them, close enough to share warmth, far enough not to intrude. Micah stirred, just slightly. His small hand moved, fingers brushing against Bruno's fur. The dog did not move, did not flinch. Just stayed. Lena noticed that. A small, fragile breath of relief left her. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, almost apologetically. Gideon didn't answer. He understood the sentence without needing to respond to it. Word didn't spread like fire. It spread like breath on cold glass. Slow. Quiet. Unmistakable. By the time the wind had fully settled into its rhythm steady, a relentless another vehicle made its way up the hill. Headlights cut through the white, hesitant at first, then more certain. Gideon stepped outside again. The truck that arrived belonged to someone who had lived in Ashbrook long enough for the town to stop noticing him. Owen Pike, 41. Broad-shouldered, thick-built, the kind of man who carried strength, not as a statement, but as a default. His beard was trimmed but uneven, like he did it himself, and didn't particularly care how it looked. His face was open in the way of someone used to being read easily. No masks, no careful distance. He stepped out, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Heard you got someone up here," Owen called, voice raised just enough to carry. Gideon nodded. Owen glanced toward the structure, then back at Gideon. "You're planning to keep this open tonight?" It wasn't a challenge, just a question that needed a real answer. Gideon looked past him, at the storm building over the hill, twas at the road already beginning to blur into white, then back at the half-built shelter, then at Bruno, visible just inside, still lying beside Lena and the child. "Yes," he said. Owen studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said simply. He reached into the back of his truck, pulling out a small portable heater and a fuel can. "Figured you might need this." Gideon stepped forward, taking it. "Thanks." Owen shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. Let's see if it works." Later, as the heater hummed softly and the wind pressed harder against the tarp, Bruno rose again. He didn't go to the door. He didn't go to Gideon. He walked slowly toward Lena. Then, without warning, he rested his head gently against her knee. Not Micah. Her. Lena froze. Her hand hovered mid-air, uncertain. Then very slowly she placed it on his head. Her fingers trembled. Not from cold. From something deeper. For a brief moment her composure broke, not loudly, yet not dramatically, but in the quiet way of someone who had held too much for too long. Gideon saw it. and for reasons he couldn't explain, something in his chest shifted, not toward pity, but toward recognition. The storm deepened. Snow fell harder now, thick enough to swallow sound. The world beyond the tarp ceased to exist, replaced by a constant, muted pressure that made time feel suspended. Inside, the small space adjusted. Owen set up the heater, testing it twice before leaving it running. Elias arrived not long after, carrying extra wood and muttering about idiots who build half a roof and call it shelter, though he stayed. Naomi came too. She moved immediately to Lena and Micah, checking the boy's breathing, his temperature, her hands steady, her voice calm. She didn't ask questions either. Not yet. That would come later, when survival wasn't the only priority. The space filled. Not crowded, but no longer empty. Each person moved around the others carefully, instinctively adjusting, making room, offering what they could, while a thermos appeared. Extra gloves. A second blanket. No one announced these things. They just happened. Gideon stood near the edge for a while, watching. Not leading, not directing, just observing. This wasn't something he had planned. Not really. He had meant to fix a house. Instead, he looked around again. At Elias, adjusting a beam even now. At Naomi, checking Micah's pulse. At Owen, crouched near the heater, listening to its hum like it might tell him something important. At Lena, sitting straighter now, one hand still resting on Bruno's head. And at Bruno, who lay at the center. Exactly where he had chosen. Gideon exhaled slowly. Somewhere along the way, without permission, without announcement. This had stopped being just his. Hours passed. The storm held. Inside, warmth gathered, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to matter. Gideon moved finally, stepping closer to the frame they had started. He ran a hand along the beam. Solid, temporary, but real. He glanced at Elias. We're reinforcing this tomorrow, he said. Elias grunted. We're doing it tonight if the wind doesn't rip it off first. A faint smile touched Gideon's mouth. Not much, but enough. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the light held. And somewhere between the sound of wind and the quiet breathing of people who had found, at least for one night, a place to stop running. The house began to exist. Not as wood, not as structure, but as something harder to destroy. Morning did not break the storm. It thinned it. The wind no longer howled, it dragged, low and heavy, like something reluctant to leave. Snow still fell, but slower now, drifting instead of striking. The world outside the tarp had softened into white silence, the kind that made sound feel like a choice rather than a consequence. Inside, the air held. Not warm, never fully warm, but protected. Gideon had been awake for hours. He stood near the edge of the structure, watching the sky through the gaps in the unfinished frame. The cold still moved through him, but it no longer owned him the way it used to. There was something else now. Not comfort. Not quite. Purpose. Behind him, the space had changed. People had settled into it. Not as guests. Not as strangers. As something closer to temporary belonging. Lena sat with her back against one of the reinforced beams. Micah curled in her lap, his breathing deeper now, steadier. The exhaustion in her face had not disappeared, but it had loosened, softened at the edges. Her hair had dried unevenly, strands curling slightly against her cheeks. Naomi knelt beside her, checking the boy again, her movements quiet and precise. She didn't rush. didn't hover. She worked with the calm rhythm of someone who had learned that panic solved nothing. Elias had not slept at all. He sat on an overturned crate, sharpening a blade with slow, methodical strokes. Not because it needed sharpening, but because his hands didn't know how to be still when something needed doing. Owen stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the storm like a man who had spent too many winters measuring danger by how the wind moved through trees. And Bruno remained where he had chosen, at the center, not moving much, not restless, just present. Gideon turned back toward them. For a brief moment, the scene felt unfamiliar, not because it was strange, but because it was something he had not allowed himself to have in a long time. People. Together. Without urgency. Without orders. Without the expectation that someone wouldn't make it through the night. He exhaled slowly. Then moved. "Structure's holding," Gideon said, voice steady. Elias glanced up, then back down at the blade. "Barely. That's enough for now." "For now," Elias echoed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe in "for now" as anything other than a temporary lie. Gideon walked to the center, crouching near Bruno. The dog opened his eyes, meeting Gideon's gaze. No question. No need. Gideon rested a hand briefly against the thick fur behind Bruno's neck. Warm, alive, reliable. He stood again. "We're reinforcing today," he said, louder this time. "But not a command, just a direction." Owen shifted his weight. "Storm's not done yet. Neither are we." A pause. Then Owen nodded. That was enough. The work began without announcement. It always did. Elias took the lead on the structure adjusting angles, reinforcing joints, checking the weight distribution of the tarp under accumulating snow. He didn't explain much. He simply moved, expecting others to follow or learn. Gideon worked beside him, matching pace. Not competing. Not questioning. Just aligning. Owen handled the exterior when visibility allowed, clearing snow from the edges, checking the approach path, making sure no one else would drive into trouble without knowing where to go. Naomi organized inside, rearranging space, making sure people had what they needed, adjusting small things that made survival easier, positioning blankets away from drafts, setting a better rhythm around the heater, keeping a quiet order in what could have easily become chaos. Lena watched at first. Then slowly she joined, not in large ways, small things, holding a beam steady, passing tools, adjusting a blanket so someone else wouldn't feel the cold as sharply. It was hesitant at first, then steadier. Hours passed like that, measured not by time, but by progress. A beam secured, a joint reinforced, a wall line defined where there had been none. The structure began to look less like a temporary hold and more like something that intended to stay. Gideon stepped back once, looking at what they had done. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. And that mattered. Bruno rose without warning. Not abruptly, not alarmed. Just certain. He walked slowly toward the far edge of the foundation, the side where the chimney stood. His steps were deliberate, each placement exact. He stopped near a section of floor Gideon hadn't touched yet, one of the darker patches, where the wood had burned deeper, yet where ash still clung in thin layers despite the clearing. Bruno lowered his head. Not to sniff. Not quite. More like listening. Then he tapped the ground once with his paw, soft, controlled, and looked back at Gideon, not waiting, not asking, just showing. Gideon didn't move immediately. Something about the gesture held him in place. Not fear, not urgency, but a quiet insistence that this moment mattered. He walked over, crouched, pressed his hand lightly against the surface. cold, still. But beneath that, there was a difference. Subtle. Almost nothing. But not nothing. He didn't speak. Didn't call the others. He simply stood again. And for the first time since arriving in Ashbrook, he allowed a thought to form fully, without pushing it away. This place is not finished telling its story. He turned back toward the others. After this, he said evenly, we clear that section. Elias glanced over. Why? Gideon held his gaze for a moment. Then, because it hasn't been checked yet. Elias studied him, then nodded. That was enough. By late afternoon, the storm had begun to break. Not completely, but enough for light to return in thin streaks through the cloud cover. The world outside regained edges. Distance came back. The lake appeared again faint, but real. Inside, the space felt different. Not just because of the work, because of what had settled into it. People moved more easily now, spoke more. A quiet laugh from Owen at something Elias muttered. Naomi explaining something softly to Lena. Micah awake, sitting upright now, watching Bruno with careful curiosity. Bruno, for his part, allowed it. The boy reached out again, fingers brushing fur. This time, he smiled. Small, but real. Gideon saw that, and something in him eased, not fully, not permanently, but enough to notice. He stepped outside for a moment. The air was still cold, but it no longer pressed the same way. The storm had spent itself. What the hill stretched out before him, white and quiet. Behind him, the structure stood, stronger than it had that morning. Not complete, but standing. He turned back, looked at the doorway. No door yet, no frame, just space, open. He could close it later, make it solid, private, safe. The thought came easily, then passed. He stepped back inside. We need a central table, he said suddenly. Elias looked up. For what? Gideon glanced at the stack of salvaged wood. For people. Owen snorted softly. That's one way to say it. Naomi smiled faintly. Lena didn't speak, but her eyes followed Gideon in a way they hadn't before. Understanding. Or maybe just hope. Gideon moved toward the salvaged beams, picked one up, turned it in his hands. Charred on the outside. Strong within. He set it down carefully. Measured. Not with tools. With instinct. Elias watched him for a moment, then stood. All right, the old man muttered. Let's see if you can build something that doesn't fall apart. Owen stepped closer. Naomi shifted the space. Even Lena stood. And Bruno. Bruno returned to the center, laying down, as if holding the place together while the rest of them learned how. Outside, the storm faded. Inside, something else began. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like a heartbeat that had been weak and had decided, quietly, to keep going. The storm left quietly, not with a final roar or a dramatic clearing, but with a slow withdrawal, like a tide slipping back into itself, leaving behind a world that looked the same, but wasn't. Morning light returned in fragments, thin beams through broken clouds, a pale glow over snow that had settled into soft, uneven layers across the hill. The trees stood still again, their branches heavy but no longer strained. The lake in the distance had regained its shape, a flat stretch of muted silver beneath the sky. Inside the structure, warmth lingered in memory more than in temperature. The heater still hummed softly, its low vibration blending into the quiet rhythm of breathing bodies, shifting boots, and the occasional creak of wood adjusting under new weight. Gideon stood at the entrance, looking out. The air was sharper now. Cleaner. Honest. Behind him, the space had changed again. Not physically, not much. The beams were the same. The tarp still stretched overhead, though now sagging slightly under melting snow. The central area was still uneven, still scarred with charred lines and darkened patches. But the feeling, that had shifted. Lena was awake, sitting upright, Micah wrapped in blankets beside her, small fingers gripping the edge as if still unsure the ground beneath him wouldn't disappear. Naomi spoke quietly with her, explaining something in a low, steady tone. Not instructions. Reassurance. Elias was already working again, inspecting the joints they had reinforced the night before, tapping wood with knuckles that knew the language of strength better than any tool. Owen stepped outside briefly, then back in, carrying a small metal container of fuel, his boots leaving damp prints across the floor. And Bruno. Bruno had moved. Not far, but no longer at the exact center. He lay just beside the space Gideon had marked for the table, his head resting on his paws, eyes open, watching everything without appearing to. Gideon noticed that. He always did. "You're not sleeping," Naomi said quietly as she approached him. Gideon didn't turn. Didn't need to. She stepped beside him, arms folded loosely against the cold. "You always say that," she replied. It wasn't a challenge, just an observation. Gideon glanced at her briefly. "You always check anyway." A faint smile touched her lips. "Yeah," she said. "I do." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not heavy. Just present. Naomi looked out over the hill. "This place," she said after a moment, "it changes people faster than most." Gideon didn't answer. He wasn't sure if she meant him, or everyone else. By mid-morning, the first signs came. Not loud. Well, it's not obvious. Just small shifts. A vehicle slowing on the road below, another passing more slowly than necessary. A figure standing near the edge of the tree line, watching, not approaching, not leaving. Word had spread. Not in the way stories did, exaggerated and twisted, but in the way truth traveled in small towns, through glances, through quiet conversations, through the kind of silence that meant something had happened, and people didn't know what to do with it yet. Gideon felt it. The attention. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just aware. Elias noticed it too. "They'll start talking now," the old man muttered, adjusting a beam. "They already are." Elias snorted softly. "Talking's easy. What matters is who listens." Gideon leaned against one of the posts, watching the road below. "Doesn't change anything." Elias paused, looked at him, then went back to work. "No," he said. "It doesn't." But the way he said it suggested something else entirely. The truck arrived just past noon. New, clean, out of place. It didn't struggle up the hill like the others had. It moved smoothly, deliberately, as if the road belonged to it. Gideon straightened before it even stopped. Bruno stood. Not tense, but alert. The engine cut. The door opened. And the man who stepped out looked like he had never once needed to earn his space in a room. Cliff Redden. Mid-40s. Tall, broad in a polished way, not built from labor, but from time spent maintaining appearance. His coat was expensive, dark wool cut sharp at the shoulders. His hair was neatly trimmed, dark with just enough gray to suggest experience rather than age. His face was clean-shaven, features defined but softened by the kind of confidence that came from rarely being challenged. His eyes were the only thing that didn't match the rest. Too still. Too measuring. He closed the door of the truck with quiet precision, then walked forward. Was each step placed carefully, as if he were already deciding what this land would become beneath his feet. Gideon didn't move. Elias stopped working. Stopped. Owen shifted his stance slightly. Naomi stepped back, instinctively placing herself closer to Lena and Micah. Bruno remained beside Gideon. Cliff smiled. It wasn't wide, not warm, just appropriate. "Gideon Hale," he said, voice smooth, controlled. "I was hoping we'd meet." Gideon nodded once. "You found me." Cliff glanced around the structure, taking in the beams, the tarp, the people. "The whole town seems to have, lately." A pause. Then, "You've done quite a bit, with very little." Not a compliment, an assessment. Gideon didn't respond. Cliff stepped closer, stopping just short of the foundation. "I represent a development group with interest in this property," he continued. "And as it turns out, there are complications regarding its current use." Elias let out a quiet breath through his nose. Owen's jaw tightened slightly, and Naomi said nothing. Gideon remained still. "What kind of complications?" he asked. Cliff's gaze shifted to the structure again. "To put it simply," he said, "this land was not intended for private redevelopment. The original deed before it became county-held contained provisions regarding its use for public welfare under certain conditions." Gideon felt something settle in his chest. Not surprise. Recognition. "Meaning?" he said. Cliff's smile returned, slightly sharper. "Meaning that what you're doing here, however admirable, may not align with the legal framework governing this property." Bruno stepped forward then. Not aggressively. Not protectively. Just forward. He stopped between Gideon and Cliff, and for the first time since the man had arrived. Cliff hesitated. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. His eyes dropped, not in fear, but in calculation, measuring something he hadn't expected. Bruno didn't growl, didn't bare teeth. He simply stood, still, unmoving. And in that silence, something shifted, not in the air, not in the structure, in the balance between two men who had just realized this wasn't going to be simple. Cliff straightened, adjusted his coat slightly. Recovered. "As I was saying," he continued, tone unchanged, "there are options available. Solutions that would benefit everyone involved." Gideon crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Cliff nodded. "We could acquire the property," he said. "Ensure proper development, infrastructure, safety. You would be compensated, of course, generously." Elias let out a dry laugh. Owen didn't. Naomi's eyes stayed on Gideon. Lena held Micah closer. Gideon looked past Cliff, at the structure, at the beams they had built, at the space where people had slept, at the place Bruno had chosen. Then back at Cliff. "And if I'm not interested?" Cliff's smile didn't fade, but something behind it did. "Then," he said calmly, "shall we pursue legal clarification, which may result in a temporary suspension of activity here until ownership and usage are resolved." A pause. Snow shifted lightly under the wind. "And that," Cliff added, "would include restricting access to the property." Silence followed. Not empty. Full. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He let the words settle. Let the implications take shape. Not in his head, in his chest. Because that was where decisions like this actually lived. He exhaled slowly. Then, "No," he said. Cliff tilted his head slightly. No, to which part? Gideon's voice didn't change. All of it. Cliff studied him. Longer this time, as if trying to determine whether this was stubbornness or something else. Then he nodded once. Very well, he said. He turned. Walked back toward his truck. Paused at the door. Just remember, he added without looking back, intent doesn't always outweigh structure. Then he got in. The engine started. The truck rolled away. But the hill fell quiet again. But not the same quiet. Not the kind that comes before something begins. The kind that comes after something has already started, and cannot be undone. Gideon stood there for a long moment, then turned back. The structure was still there. The people were still there. Bruno returned to his side. Naomi stepped forward slightly. Elias picked up his tools again. Owen moved toward the heater. Lena didn't speak, but she didn't leave. Gideon looked at all of them, then at the unfinished table, then at the beams, then at the open doorway. No door, no lock, no boundary, just space. He stepped forward, picked up a beam, set it in place, and began again. The day after Cliff Redden left did not feel like victory. It felt like something had been marked. Not on paper. Not yet. But in the way the town looked at the hill. The air carried a different weight that morning. Not the cold of winter, but the quiet tension of people who had begun to understand that something mattered and might be taken. Gideon noticed it in the road first. More vehicles. Not stopping. Just slowing. Looking. Then moving on. He didn't wave. Didn't acknowledge. He simply worked. The structure had changed again overnight. Not physically, at least. Not in ways that would impress anyone who measured things by finished walls or painted surfaces. But inside, the space held memory now. The faint scent of smoke mixed with damp wool. The lingering warmth where bodies had gathered. At the subtle arrangement of objects left behind, a cup set slightly off-center, a folded blanket not quite returned to its original place, evidence, not of construction, of presence. Gideon ran a hand along one of the beams, feeling the roughness beneath his palm. Still solid, still holding. He nodded once to himself, then reached for another piece of salvaged wood. Elias arrived without announcement. As usual. His truck made its way up the hill with that familiar, uneven rhythm, engine growling in a way that sounded less like malfunction and more like stubborn refusal to quit. He stepped out, tools already in hand. Didn't greet, didn't comment. Just looked, at the structure, at the table taking shape, at Gideon. Then, "You didn't stop," he said. Gideon shook his head. "Didn't see a reason to." Elias grunted. "Good." That was all. But it carried weight. Owen came next. No heater this time. Just himself and a thermos. He tossed it toward Gideon, who caught it easily. "Coffee," Owen said. Strong enough to make you regret it." Gideon unscrewed the lid, took a sip. It burned. Not badly. Just enough. "Yeah," he said. "That'll do." Owen leaned against one of the posts, eyes scanning the structure, then drifting toward the road below. "They're talking," he said. Gideon didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "They always do," he replied. Owen nodded, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Different this time?" Naomi arrived later. On foot, her boots crunched steadily through the snow as she made her way up the hill, a bag slung over her shoulder. Her hair was tied tighter today, less loose, less forgiving. There was something sharper in her posture. Not fear. Resolve. She stepped inside without hesitation. Micah's better, she said. Lena, too. Gideon nodded. Good. Naomi looked around, taking in the progress. The table frame, the reinforced beams, the open doorway, then back at Gideon. You know he's not done, she said. It wasn't a question. Gideon set the wood down carefully. No, he said. He's not. Naomi held his gaze. Then neither are we. A pause. Then she moved past him, setting her bag down and beginning to organize the space again, like she had already decided where she stood. It started with one person. An old woman. She walked slower than the rest of the world, but with a steadiness that didn't ask for help. Her coat was too large for her frame, hanging loosely over shoulders that had long since given up trying to appear strong. Her hair, white and thin, was tucked beneath a faded wool hat. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from years. Martha Keene. She had lived in Ashbrook longer than most buildings had. She stopped at the edge of the structure, didn't step in, just stood there, looking, at the beams, at the table, at Gideon. Then, without a word, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small bundle, wrapped in cloth, worn, carefully kept. She walked forward and placed it on the unfinished table, unwrapped it. Inside, old silverware, not polished, not valuable, but kept. I used to eat here, she said quietly. Her voice wasn't fragile. It was certain. Before the fire? Gideon didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Martha looked at the table again, then at Gideon. Don't let them take it, she said. Not as a request. As something closer to a passing of responsibility. Then she turned and walked away. Slowly, but without hesitation. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, not with fear, with meaning. Owen straightened. Elias stopped working. Naomi looked down at the silverware, her fingers brushing lightly against the worn handles. Gideon stood still, then reached out, picked up one piece. It was heavier than it looked. Not in weight, in history. He set it back down carefully. Aligned, as if placement mattered. Maybe it did. The next person came an hour later. Then another. Not many. Not at once. Just one at a time. A man who left a bundle of firewood without speaking. A teenage girl who dropped off a box of canned food, eyes darting quickly as if unsure she was allowed to be there. A middle-aged couple who stood at the edge, said nothing, but stayed long enough for their presence to count. No announcements. No speeches. Just small acts. Elias watched it happen, shook his head once. Funny, he muttered. Takes a fire to burn a place down. Takes people this long to build it back. Gideon didn't answer. He was watching the table. The afternoon passed in steady rhythm. More wood, more hands, more quiet decisions made without needing to be spoken aloud. The table took shape. Not perfect, not smooth, but strong. Built from the charred pieces Gideon had refused to throw away. Each plank different, each mark visible. No attempt to hide what it had been, only to make it useful again. Ruth Bell arrived just before dusk. She walked with purpose, straight-backed, precise, her steps measured in a way that suggested she had spent most of her life navigating things that didn't forgive mistakes. Ruth Bell, early 50s. Sharp features, dark hair pulled tightly back, eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. She wore a long coat buttoned all the way up, not for warmth, but for order. She stopped just inside the structure, looked around once, took everything in, then focused on Gideon. "You need to understand something," she said. No greeting, no introduction. Gideon nodded slightly. "Go on." Ruth stepped closer. "The original deed," she said, "was never properly dissolved when the county took possession. That clause about community use it still exists." Owen shifted. Naomi turned. Elias listened. Gideon remained still. "And?" he asked. What Ruth's gaze sharpened. "And you are the only person currently in violation of it, and the only person currently fulfilling it." A pause. Snow drifted softly outside. "That makes this," she gestured around them, "very difficult to take away. Legally." Gideon studied her. "Difficult," he repeated. Ruth nodded once. "But not impossible," she added. Then her tone changed, slightly, almost imperceptibly. "If no one stands with you." Silence. Then she turned, walked toward the table, ran her fingers lightly across the surface, across the burn marks, across the grain, then stepped back. "I'll file what I can," she said, "but paperwork doesn't hold ground." She looked at the others, then back at Gideon. "People do." And with that, she left. The light faded slowly, not abruptly. The sky dimmed, turning the snow outside into a pale reflection of something deeper, quieter. Inside, the structure held. The table stood. The silverware remained where Martha had placed it. As Gideon stepped forward, placed both hands on the table, felt the surface. Rough, uneven, real. He looked around. At Elias, at Owen, at Naomi, at the small things left behind by people who hadn't stayed, but had chosen not to ignore. Then, at Bruno, who lay beside the table now, not in the center, but close enough, as if the center had shifted. Gideon exhaled. Slowly, then, "We're not stopping," he said. No one argued. No one needed to. Outside, the town of Ashbrook watched. Inside, something had already decided to stand. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments like forgiveness, a patch of earth showing through where snow had melted unevenly, the sound of water slipping quietly beneath ice before the surface gave way. The first bird that returned too early, testing the air like a question. Ashbrook changed slowly, so slowly that no one could point to the exact moment it happened. But Gideon felt it. In the mornings, when the cold no longer clung to his lungs the same way. In the afternoons, when light stayed just a little longer on the hill. In the evenings, when the house, because it was a house now, undeniably held more than warmth. It held voices. The structure stood complete in its own way. Not polished. Not finished in the way people in cities would understand. There were no perfect lines, no matching panels, or no sense of artificial symmetry, but it was strong. The beams had settled into place, reinforced by hands that knew both wood and weight. The tarp had been replaced by a proper roof patched, uneven, but reliable. The open doorway still had no door. Gideon had left it that way, not out of neglect, out of choice. The table stood at the center, built from charred wood that still carried the memory of fire in its grain. No attempt had been made to sand it smooth or hide the scars. Each mark remained visible, as if the past had been invited to stay, not as a wound, but as part of the structure. Bruno lay beside it, not always in the same place anymore, but always close. Mornings had begun to follow a rhythm. Elias arrived first, as he always did, his truck announcing itself before he stepped out. He no longer inspected the structure like it might fail. Now he moved through it like a man who recognized something familiar in it, something worth maintaining. Owen came and went, depending on the roads, the weather, the needs of the town. But when he came, he stayed longer than necessary. Naomi stayed the longest. Not every night, but often enough that her presence had become part of the space, like the table or the beams, or the quiet understanding that this place was no longer temporary. Lena and Micah had not left. Not completely. They had found a small place in town, but they returned daily. Lena helped organize supplies, now keeping things in order, in a way that suggested she needed structure as much as the house did. Micah moved more freely, his small hands no longer clutching at fabric with the same fear. He laughed sometimes. Bruno tolerated that. Gideon watched all of it. He did not lead. He did not instruct. He simply stayed. And that had become enough. The letter arrived on a clear afternoon. Not dramatic, not urgent, just official. It came folded cleanly, delivered by hand, placed on the table without ceremony. Gideon knew what it was before he opened it. He had been expecting something. He just hadn't known when. He unfolded it slowly. Read it once. Then again. Not because he didn't understand, but because understanding didn't always mean acceptance. Naomi watched him from across the room. "What is it?" she asked. Gideon lowered the paper slightly. "They're moving forward," he said. "Formal review. Possible claim on usage rights." Silence settled. Not shocked. Prepared. Elias didn't look up from his work. Owen's jaw tightened. Lena stilled. Micah didn't notice. Bruno did. The dog lifted his head, eyes fixed on Gideon, not reacting to the paper, but to the shift inside him. Gideon folded the letter carefully, set it on the table. Aligned. As if placement still mattered. Later that evening, when the others had drifted into quiet tasks, and the light had softened into that pale gold that only northern evenings carried, Bruno stood. He moved not to the door, not to Gideon, but to the threshold, at the open space where a door should have been. He stopped there, sat, facing outward, not watching the road, not watching the trees, watching nothing, or everything. Gideon stepped closer, followed his gaze. The hill stretched out below, calm, untouched. But there was something in the stillness, something that didn't feel like absence, more like waiting. Bruno didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, as if guarding something that hadn't arrived yet. Gideon felt it again, that quiet shift. Not fear, not anticipation. Just the sense that whatever came next, this place would not face it alone. The days that followed did not bring immediate answers. No officials, no enforcement, just time. And in that time, people chose. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Martha returned, this time with more than silverware. A small wooden box inside, old photographs, faded images of the house before the fire. People gathered, faces younger, softer. Evidence that what stood now had once held life before and could again. She placed them on the table, did not explain, did not need to. Others came. Not all at once, but enough. A man who had once laughed at Gideon's decision now brought lumber from a dismantled shed. A woman who had never spoken to him before left jars of preserved food near the entrance. 2 teenagers arrived awkwardly, offering to help repair the outer frame. Each act small. Each one deliberate. Ruth returned as well. Her steps were the same, measured, precise. But there was something different in her expression now. Not softer, more certain. "They're building a case," she said. Gideon nodded. "I figured." Ruth looked around the structure. At the table. At the photographs. At the people moving quietly through the space. Then back at him. "You're going to need more than paperwork." Gideon met her gaze. "I know." Ruth nodded once. "Good." She paused, then added, "They won't expect this." She gestured not at the building, at the people. Then she left. The evening settled slowly, light fading, air cooling, but not as sharply as before. Spring was still coming, even if it took its time. Gideon stood near the table again, hands resting on its surface. He looked at the wood, the burn marks, the uneven lines, then at the room, at Elias, at Owen, at Naomi, at Lena, at Micah, at Bruno, still near the doorway, still watching. There had been a time, not long ago, when Gideon had believed that staying anywhere too long was a mistake, that nothing held, that everything eventually broke, burned, disappeared. But this wasn't something he had found. It wasn't something he had taken. It was something that had formed. Around him, without asking, without permission. Naomi stepped beside him. "You could still leave," she said quietly. Not pushing, not pleading, just stating a truth. Gideon nodded. "I could." He looked at the doorway, at the open space, at the hill beyond, then back at the table, and at the marks that had not been erased, at the people who had not walked away. "I'm not going to," he said. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't need to. Gideon moved. Picked up one of the remaining pieces of charred wood, walked toward the entrance, set it into place above the frame, not as a barrier, as a marker. Something that said, "This place exists. This place stays." Elias joined him, without a word. Owen followed. Naomi adjusted the alignment. Lena held the beam steady. Micah watched. Bruno remained at the threshold. Together. They finished it. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Above the entrance, carved into the wood, simple, unpolished. Clear. Hearth house. Beneath it, smaller, less certain, but still there, built from ash, kept alive by hands. The sun slipped below the horizon. Light faded, but the house did not go dark. Inside, the fire burned, steady, warm, alive. And out there, beyond the hill, beyond the town, beyond whatever came next, the world continued. Uncertain, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But here, there was a place. Not perfect, not finished, but standing. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as light from the sky or voices in the wind. Sometimes they look like a man who refuses to walk away. A dog who stays when everything else leaves. And a place that was once broken, choosing to hold people again. Maybe God doesn't always change our circumstances overnight. Maybe He places us exactly where we're needed, even when we don't understand why at first. And through small acts, warm hands, open doors, quiet courage, He builds something greater than we ever planned. In our daily lives, we often wait for a sign, something big enough to prove that hope is still real. But what if the miracle is already there, in the chance to help someone, in the strength to stay when it's easier to leave, in the people who stand beside us when everything feels uncertain? If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you believe in stories that heal, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing more like this together. May God watch over you, protect your path, and bring warmth into your life, even in the coldest seasons.